This is Addiscombe tram stop. It opened in 2000 and it lies on the branch to Beckenham Junction and Elmer's End. But there's a little more to it than that. Immediately to the south of the stop, just over the road, there's a wall. A sort of broken-looking wall, like it used to be part of something else. This is the site of an abandoned station, Bingham Road. The station was here. Well, actually it was here. The station was built on an embankment carried across the road on a bridge. As you might imagine, there's not much left of it today, but it used to look like this. But that was the second version of the station. The first version opened on the site of what is now the tram stop. It was built for the Woodside and South Croydon Joint Railway, and that railway was kind of an odd one. The way it happened was this. In this part of South London in the 19th century there were three railway companies: the London, Brighton and South Coast, the South Eastern and the London, Chatham and Dover. And they were all scrambling for territory, just building railways all over the place in the hope of getting a decent share of passengers, but also in the hopes of blocking their rivals. The result was just a mess. Lines all over the place that weren't really needed and were often inconveniently located. The Woodside and South Croydon Railway was a railway jointly owned by the South Eastern Railway and the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, built in the desperate hope that if they joined forces maybe they could make their tangle of tracks pay. In 1885 they opened their line and, spoiler, they couldn't make it pay. In fact, they were talking about closing it down as early as 1895. In the early 20th century, they began to reconsider their approach. They began running short trains, typically one coach in length. These were either push-pull trains, consisting of a single coach either pushed or pulled by a small locomotive like this, or rail motors, which consisted of a single coach with a small locomotive built into it. But also they added a couple of halts to the line, at Spencer Road and Bingham Road. A halt is basically a pared-down low-cost station. There are various different definitions for what constitutes a halt as opposed to a station, but in the steam age the usual characteristics were that they were unstaffed, they had no goods facilities, they were very basic in their construction, and trains often skipped them or only stopped on request. Bingham Road was a perfect example of the genre. It had wooden platforms, no shelter, and a foot crossing at track level to get between the platforms. The station opened in 1906. It was not popular. The trams ran nearby, and they were already well established as well as being cheap and frequent. And for commuting into London, the Woodside and South Croydon just wasn't a very direct line. Worse still, Addiscombe station was within easy walking distance and poached a lot of traffic. By 1913, the owners were once again talking about closure. The First World War gave them just the excuse they needed. Wartime economies were a useful means for a lot of railways to get rid of a lot of unremunerative stations. Bingham Road, along with the rest of the line, closed to passengers in March of 1915. The track remained in place and was still used for special workings, but maintenance was cut back to the bare minimum. But it turned out that it was not dead, but merely slept. New hope came in the form of a campaign to open a new line from Sanderstead to Orpington. The main promoter was Colonel Stevens, a man famous for buying up failed rural branch lines and running them on a shoestring. This proposed line was something very different. It was a commuter line intended to stimulate housing development in the suburbs it served. It was to be operated by the Southern Railway, who had taken over all the railways I've been talking about in this video in 1923. This new line, that was to be called the Southern Heights Light Railway, is a pretty big subject and it may well get its own dedicated video. But the long and short of it is that it was authorised in 1927, but funds couldn't be raised to build it. While the line didn't get built, the Southern Railway were interested enough to rebuild the old Woodside and South Croydon line, which would link with the new line, and they then planned to electrify the whole shebang. In the 1920s, the Southern Railway were all about electrification, which they saw as a way to stay competitive against the London Underground and the trams. The rebuilding of the line meant the reopening of stations. Perhaps somewhat optimistically, the Southern decided that Bingham Road should be more substantial, and so the old halt was demolished and replaced with a new, more substantial station in brick and concrete, complete with all the facilities you'd expect of a suburban stop. That wall I showed you earlier was part of the covered stairway leading up to the platforms. The new station opened in September 1935. Well, it was more popular than the original station, but not by much. The proximity of other railways meant that the Southern was in competition with itself a lot of the time, the long-term consequence of the insane Victorian scramble to build railways across South London. Passengers just weren't very interested in Bingham Road. The outbreak of another world war in 1939 justified cutting services back, but they weren't reinstated with peacetime. In 1948 the line was nationalised, and in 1949 the new management, British Railways, decided to eliminate direct services into London altogether. Services would be reduced to a shuttle between Sanderstead and Elmer's End, which reduced the line from not very useful to basically pointless. So, of course, passenger numbers fell still further. Now, this sounds a little bit like closure by stealth, i.e. making the railway line such a pain to use that passenger numbers decline to the point where closure is basically forced. Management can throw up their hands and say, "Not us, Gov, it's the passengers' fault." But in the mid-50s, the platforms at Bingham Road and elsewhere on the line were lengthened to take 10-coach trains, which is pretty inexplicable at a time when 2 coaches was optimistic. So I don't know what British Railways were thinking. At this point I really should mention the station's one claim to fame, which was a brief appearance in the 1961 film The Rebel, starring Tony Hancock. In this film, Bingham Road was renamed to Fortune Green South, and portrayed as being absolutely packed out during rush hour. The kind of unintentional joke to which Hancock himself might have fallen victim. Management, however, were not laughing. In 1961, British Railways looked at their lines in South London and presumably shook their heads sadly. The Sanderstead and Addiscombe lines were, frankly, a bit of a joke. They'd have to go. Addiscombe was spared on the grounds that it was a bit busier than the Sanderstead line, and closing would put more strain on the already overcrowded East Croydon and Norbury Junction stations. But the Sanderstead line had no such excuse. So, in December 1962, closure was announced. Bingham Road was actually the busiest station on the line at this point, but that really wasn't saying much. The line would receive a stay of execution in an incredibly ironic fashion. One of the local MPs raised objections because his constituents did not have adequate alternative transport. This MP happened to be the Minister for Transport, and his name was Ernest Marples. You may have heard of the Beeching Acts, the mass closure of hundreds of miles of railway across Britain on the recommendation of Dr. Richard Beeching. Well, Marples was kind of the Emperor Palpatine to Beeching's Darth Vader. His anti-rail policies were not entirely surprising, given his interest in the road construction company Marples Ridgeway. That was far from the only dodgy thing he was involved in, and he would flee the country in 1975 to avoid a hefty tax bill. So you can see why it's kind of ironic that he should be the saviour of the Sanderstead line. The postponement of closure was meant to last 3 years, but in fact it lasted more than 2 decades. But by the early 1980s it just couldn't be justified any longer. It was not unknown for off-peak trains to run empty. And when I say empty, I mean they had literally no passengers. So in May 1983 the line closed completely, for the second time. Bingham Road stood empty for nearly a year, but it was demolished in 1984. That may seem like the inevitable end of the story of Bingham Road, but in fact it was anything but. The problem of inadequate public transport had never been properly dealt with, and consequently the roads around Croydon were choked with traffic. At this time, the government were exploring the concept of light rail as a means of revitalising unpopular and closed railways, and the Sanderstead line was one of the routes they considered as a test bed. In 1991, this had evolved into the Tramlink concept, which was envisaged to take over not only the Sanderstead line, but the West Croydon to Wimbledon line and part of the Addiscombe line. The Tramlink bore little resemblance to the trams that had caused Bingham Road so much trouble in the early days. Instead, it was a light rail system that would sometimes use street running, but mostly be segregated from traffic. This was seen as an ideal solution. There were too many passengers for the buses, but as had been demonstrated very vividly, there weren't enough for trains. Trams fell in between. The scheme was approved in 1994. Originally, the idea was that the line would simply recycle the old railway embankment, albeit somewhat raised to allow greater clearance under the bridge at Bingham Road. Instead, the Tramlink folk changed their minds and had the embankment demolished, and the track laid at ground level. There was to be a stop almost adjacent to the old station and directly on the site of the original halt. In the planning stages, it was named Bingham Road. However, Addiscombe station had closed in 1997, and so it was decided to transfer the name to the new stop. Addiscombe tram stop opened in 2000 with the rest of the line. These days, as I'm sure you can tell from the footage in this video, there's basically nothing to show that there was ever a railway station there. The bridge, the platform, even the embankment is gone. Not even the name survives. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like, as always, to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the new railway proposal to my closed line. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.